Welcome back to Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion. I'm your instructor, Professor Leitner, and today we're talking about witches and witchcraft, just in time for the spooky season. So, witches are nothing new. Witches go back a long way in every society, and it's not just about old women in pointy hats. What you know about witches is probably just the tip of the iceberg. Today we're going to try and fill in some of those gaps for you. Now, defining witches can be a little bit tricky because it really depends on what we're talking about. Today, we're going to talk about at least sort of four main kinds of witch that you're probably familiar with. Maybe the last one, not as much. We're going to talk about the good old Halloween witch. We're going to talk about the pop culture witch. We're going to talk about the historical witch. And finally, the anthropological witch. So let's get started. To start off with, let's tackle some of the witches you might already be familiar with. I'm going to call this modern American witches because particularly the Halloween witch really sort of comes out of American Halloween traditions. I've got a little asterisk here. There are modern American witches, real ones. They practice Wicca, paganism, neo-paganism, number of different versions of personal nature-based religions. I'm not going to be covering them today. Hopefully in the future I'll be able to put a better, longer video together about that, but I kind of want to do it justice and not just kind of brush through it in this one. So we're not going to cover that today, but I wanted to acknowledge that they do exist. The Halloween Witch. This is the one you know from fairy tales. It's the one you know from the kids' costumes every Halloween. It's the one we all grew up with. She's a little bit scary, but also kind of in a safe way. Always a woman, but that's important because one of the things she does is invert norms of femininity. They tend to be green-skinned crones in shapeless dresses with pointy hats or warts and all of this stuff. They had loud, cackling, crackly voices, exaggerated facial features, which may themselves have some racial undertones. And they are oftentimes seen riding their brooms and brewing potions, doing nefarious things and up to no good. Now let's contrast that with another kind of Halloween witch. As Halloween has become more and more of an adult holiday as well, we have started seeing costumes that we might call the sexy witch. She's not from the fairy tales, right? And instead of inverting norms of femininity, she is there amplifying specific norms of femininity. Um, Oftentimes she is hypersexualized. Oftentimes she is dressed in very impractical clothing, and it is there as a display of sexuality. It's still fun for people. I'm not knocking this, but there are specific reasons why this costume is popular and also why it is pushed so heavily. Finally, in this category of the sort of modern American witch trope here, we got to look at pop culture. There have been representations of witches in media for a long time. They've changed a bit over the years, but they all kind of share some things in common. Whether we're talking about Samantha from Bewitched in the 50s and 60s, or the sisters in Hocus Pocus, or any of these newer shows that have come up, the witches are always either sort of comical villains, if they're villains, or more often they're ordinary women with extraordinary powers. In other words, instead of being strange monsters, they are just normal women dealing with everyday problems that normal women deal with, but with some magic added. Contemporary shows are often contain some at least surface level feminist elements and messaging as well, although that can very easily be challenged. But in general, the sort of pop culture witch is one that is supposed to be a vehicle for the viewer to sort of put themselves in the place of. The historical witch. So now we're going to dig into at least the European history of witches and witchcraft. We have to mention that witchcraft appears in the Bible because so much of the history of witches in Europe is tied in with Christianity. Now, when I say it's in the Bible, it's not just in the Christian Bible, it is there in the Torah as well. So it is part of the Abrahamic faiths that witches are mentioned and witchcraft is mentioned. There are several biblical laws against witchcraft. You may or may not be familiar with some of these. They appear in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. You shall not tolerate a sorceress. You shall not eat anything with its blood. You shall not practice divination or soothsaying. A man or a woman who has a ghost or a familiar spirit shall be put to death. They shall be pelted with stones, and the blood guilt is theirs. Let no one be found among you who consigns a son or daughter to the fire, or who is an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. Now, it can be argued that actually a lot of these are less about witchcraft itself being wholly the problem, so much as, at least within the biblical sort of Israelite context, that these were laws forbidding people from doing things that the neighboring foreign nations did. And it was about sort of saying, this is not how we define ourselves. That said, there are some pretty clear messages. In the book of Samuel, we've got the story of Saul consulting the witch of Endor. The evening before a great battle with the Philistines, Saul goes to this foreign soothsayer and necromancer and asks her to raise the spirit of Samuel. And the spirit is, and there's some question whether it's really Samuel or not, but the spirit rises and it berates Saul for disobeying God by coming and consulting a witch. And it therefore prophesies doom for Saul and his army against the Philistines. So Saul is being punished for seeking advice from this woman because of his lack of faith in God. He had tried getting God to give him some sign. God didn't give him signs, and so he went out of the house, so to speak. The woman is portrayed as foreign in this, but I think personally it's debatable whether she's evil or not. So that brings us to the European history of witches and witchcraft. So, because of the laws in the Bible, the church's official position was, of course, that witchcraft, soothsaying, divining were not things Christians should be doing. However, they discouraged the hunting of witches. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just meant that the church discouraged priests and clergy from going around doing this. There was some recognition that it could become problematic. Even in the manuals for the Inquisition, not known for their very reasoned attitude towards heresy, it suggested they not start going hunting for witches because it was very problematic. This, of course, lasts until about the early modern period. That's the late 14th to 16th century. And, through up until the 17th, or through the 17th. And then we see this explosion of witch hunts and the development of secular means for dealing with witches. The first big move towards secularizing the punishment of witchcraft comes with Henry VIII's Witchcraft Act of 1541, which made witchcraft for the first time a felony punishable by death and forfeiture of property. Before, it was just considered sort of a spiritual, it was a sin and it was a spiritual failing, but it wasn't the death penalty. This also removed witchcraft from the jurisdiction of the church courts and made it a civil matter for the first time. There would be 6 more of these witchcraft laws passed between 1541 and 1735, and the Act of 1735 did not get repealed until 1951. So for the most part in European history, witch trials were a kind of idiosyncratic. There'd be one here, one there occasionally, but they weren't a common thing, and you didn't have lots of people being swept up into them until you get to this period. And then we have what are called the witch crazes or witch hunts. So we see this fervor for finding and punishing witches also in the number of treatises that were published on how to identify, torture, and execute them. One of the first of these was the Malleus Maleficarum, which I have a little mistake here. It's not 1846. I believe that's 1546. And that translates to the Hammer of Witches. It names sorcery as a heresy. This is important because the church had forbidden witchcraft for itself from being punished, but heresy was one of the worst sins someone could commit. This book was condemned by the clergy and the Inquisition, in part because it was recommending what they saw as illegal procedures, and it was inconsistent with the Catholic demonology of the time. It, however, established the doctrine that women were more likely to be witches and really sort of set into practice this sort of scapegoating of women for witchcraft. In 1597, King James I publishes Demonology, which was a study of the methods that demons use to trick humans into deals, and it endorsed witch hunting. Some say that it was a reaction to Reginald Scott's publication of The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584. Scott's manual is very interesting because he didn't really believe in witches, and he said most of what was called witchcraft was actually the result of essentially con men working illusions, not in a preternatural sense, but in the stage magician sense. In fact, it's one of the oldest books we have that records how to make things disappear, legerdemain, close-up magic, that sort of thing. The witch craze, however, starts exploding during the English Civil War, partly due to heightened religious tensions. And this is the situation into which Matthew Hopkins dubs himself the Witchfinder General. Matthew Hopkins and his friend John Stern went from town to town in East Anglia. That's like the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, and a little bit of Essex in England. And they would charge these towns extortionate fees to find, identify, and force confessions out of witches. Between 1644 and 1647, Hopkins and Stern were responsible for the hanging of more witches than had been hung in the 160 years prior to that. Their methods for getting confessions included everything from sleep deprivation to cutting people with blunt knives, and if they didn't bleed, they were a witch. The swimming test, by which it was believed that if you had sold your immortal soul to the devil, water would not accept you and you would float to the top However, if you still had your immortal soul, it would accept you and draw you down, and you would sink. Yes, this is exactly what they were doing in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It was based on something real. Finally, the investigation of the body for signs of a pact with Satan. This could include anything from extra nipples to birthmarks to any kind of strange mark they wanted to identify. Oftentimes, if it was an extra nipple or a mole or a birthmark, they said this is where the witch's familiar, a demon in the form of a common animal, would come and suckle on them to gain sustenance. So they would use all of these tricks to essentially force people to confess. Upon his retirement in 1647, he publishes The Discovery of Witches, not to be confused with Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft. This was part autobiography, part torture manual. It detailed his methods for extracting confessions, many, if not all of which, were taken directly from King James's demonology, and quickly became a popular legal text, especially in the American colonies. No discussion of the history of witchcraft would be complete without some discussion of the Salem witch trials. Now, I should start by saying there were many witch trials that preceded the Salem ones. Those took place in 1692, but the first witch hanging in the American colonies was in 1647. Her name was Alsa, sometimes Alice Young. She was born in 1615 in Windsor, Connecticut. No record of her trial exists, but there is a record of her having been hung in Hartford, Connecticut. It is speculated that she might have been blamed for a bad influenza outbreak in which a prominent family lost some of its younger members. 30 years later, the daughter that Alice left behind was also condemned for witchcraft as well. In 1662, in Hartford, we have the first of the witch crazes in the colonies. It starts when 8-year-old Elizabeth Kelly dies mysteriously, and reportedly, according to her parents, as she was dying, she cursed her neighbor, Goody Ayres, for causing this. Ann Cole, then another member of the community, was having shaking fits and started accusing her neighbor, Rebecca Greensmith, Ayres, and others who were already suspected in Elizabeth's death. Greensmith admitted having familiarity with the devil and implicated 7 others, including her husband. The Greensmiths and at least 2 others were hanged. Ayres managed to escape, and it's unclear what happened to some of the others. So why do we have these periods of time when these witch crazes occur? Why are there just these sudden explosions in accusations and executions? Well, in the case of the executions in East Anglia, the English Civil War was going on. The country had been in upheaval because of religious tensions, especially tensions between the church and crown, and attitudes of whether or not the king would be Catholic. In Salem, we've got a small community that is on the edge in a whole bunch of ways. It thought of itself as being on the edge of the frontier for sure. What we know wasn't going on was that it was not ergot poisoning, although that's a theory that was put forth a few decades ago. Since then, there have been studies that show that that is highly unlikely. Instead, it's easier to explain by understanding the fact that Salem had been experiencing several waves of settlers moving in. So new faces, new groups of people, not all of whom agreed with the existing groups in terms of religion, in terms of attitudes. There were economic tensions between Salem Village, which was very rural, and Salem Town, which was more urban. So much so that the village even formed its own church with a controversial pastor. Also, you had conflict with the French settlers in the area and their native allies as well. And finally, the real kicker is they had experienced smallpox outbreaks and lots of hard weather and hunger, failed crops. So the history of witchcraft in Europe is really one of there always being a sort of background belief in witches, but periodically, when things would get tense, when there was a lot of strife, a lot of tension, a lot of hardship, then suddenly those beliefs became tools for social control. And you would have these outbreaks of witch crazes. I want to now put that into context with what anthropologists know about witchcraft around the world. To begin with, let's talk about some of the differences between European witch crazes and witchcraft elsewhere. Belief in witches had been present in European cultures long before the early modern era, but it was always considered a religious matter, and the accusations were rare and isolated. The early modern era saw an upheaval in the change in the power of the Catholic Church, rival Christian beliefs and sects rising up, technological and economic changes, and even changes in the relationship of the church and state. So these crazes are sort of paroxysms of social and religious tension. The tension sort of reaching a climax and this horrible stuff happening. So what does witchcraft look like elsewhere? Well, to begin with, we should understand that people tend to distinguish between what we might call sorcery and what we can call witchcraft. Sorcery is generally believed to be supernatural action performed deliberately through rituals and objects. It's a learned skill and it's usually malicious, though not always. So, in other words, you have to do magic to commit sorcery. Witchcraft, on the other hand, is generally considered to be an inherent power that people have, often tied to emotions like spite and jealousy. It's a natural ability, it's not a learned one, and it's often tied to these antisocial emotions. But the most important thing is there's always the possibility the person doesn't know that they're doing it. You could be a witch, you could be performing witchcraft on people without knowing you're doing it. So, in other societies, witchcraft accusations do act as a form of social control. In principle, anyone can be accused, although, as we'll point out in a little bit, that's usually not the case. Some people are more likely to be accused than others, and those are people at the margins. Uh, but in general, people try not to do things that would make them targets for an accusation. There's an emphasis on politeness, on showing respect, not showing envy or spite. And the oracles or the people who operate the oracles, or you might consider them witch finders, have some leeway in terms of pressuring people to make amends before the accusation gets confirmed, because once it's confirmed, there's no other way to handle the situation than to take the prescribed actions. In practice, these accusations act to encourage oftentimes cooperation between people. They can cause people to be redistributing resources, becoming more generous, because again, you want to avoid making people jealous of you, not just of you being jealous. And it helps sort of maintain social integration of individuals because the ones who aren't socially integrated tend to be the first targets. Unfortunately, these accusations are mostly aimed at marginal members of society, most commonly women, newcomers, people who aren't well socially integrated, and any form of other. Now, when we look around the world, witchcraft beliefs are incredibly common. As you can see geographically, almost everywhere we look, there's some percentage of people who believe in witches. The gray uh, countries on this map were not included in the sample, so we don't have data for those. But in all of the others, you can see a range of beliefs. In 2022, Gershon, who produced this map, found that witchcraft beliefs across the world, by making a cross-cultural comparison, tended to correlate to conformist cultures and countries with weak institutions. So, in other words, countries where there were a lot of pressures to stay in line, and also where the government didn't really have a lot of ways to sort of enforce laws. So a lot of legal systems are informal, a lot of conflict management is informal. It also tended to be correlated with exposure to certain shocks, agricultural drought, unemployment, and it might provide a coping mechanism for that. Why did I lose my job? Because of the random vicissitudes of the global economy? That sucks. Because somebody is cursing me? Well, at least I can do something about that. I can go try and get some protection. The problem is this comes at a steep cost for these countries, including possibly destroying the social fabric and trust between people, heightened everyday anxiety, and economic stagnation. People with higher levels of education and economic security, they found, were less likely to believe. However, it wasn't that much less, and these beliefs tend to cut across. They appear in every socioeconomic, every socio-demographic strata that they identified. To quote the article, also, technological development, urbanization, and other aspects of globalization may actually revive rather than alleviate witchcraft concerns by rupturing pre-existing traditional social organization and triggering the conformity-inducing function of witchcraft beliefs and accusations. In other words, as the world is changing, as these changes come to these countries, they are causing disruptions. And one of the ways of coping with the disruptions are witchcraft accusations, for better or for worse. So I want to leave you with some final thoughts, right? Why is it that people believe in witchcraft if it has such damaging effects in many cases? Because yes, it does provide some coping mechanisms, but why do they keep doing it? I want to read a passage, or at least excerpts from a passage, from Evans Pritchard's Witchcraft Among the Azandi, and hopefully that'll shed some light on it. Zandi belief in witchcraft in no way contradicts empirical knowledge of cause and effect. We must not be deceived by their way of expressing causation and imagine that because they say a man was killed by witchcraft, they entirely neglect the secondary causes that, as we judge them, were the true causes of his death. They are foreshortening the chain of events, and in a particular social situation are selecting the cause that is socially relevant and neglecting the rest. The attribution of misfortune to witchcraft does not exclude what we call its real causes, but is superimposed on them and gives to social events their moral value. This goes back to something I think I said earlier in the semester, which was, Evans Pritchard gave us a really great story among the Azandi and how witchcraft accusations work. A man fell asleep under a grain hut in the afternoon, and the grain hut fell on top of him. Now, immediately, witchcraft accusations started going around, and the first thing people are trying to do is figure out who is the witch that caused this. But Evans Pritchard says to his informants, but that granary was riddled with termites. It was going to come down someday. That's like a certainty. And they responded to him, yes, we know this, of course. The question is, why did it only come down when that particular person was lying under it that time? They want to know why. They need to know why things happen. There needs to be meaning for unpredictable, disturbing events in our lives. And whether that comes with lots of other costs or not, it is something very human and something that we all do to some degree. And that is why witchcraft beliefs persist and persist and persist. I hope you've enjoyed this, or not. At least I hope it was informative. And I hope you guys have a great week, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.